It's fun to have conversations and then share them. Arrow.net, ARROE.net. We are unplugged and totally uncut with Mark Anthony Neal.
I'm good. How you doing, Arrow?
Absolutely fantastic. A lot of people don't understand that we are right here in the Carolinas and that between Raleigh and Charlotte, our comedy clubs have been absolutely the most supportive groups when it comes to black comedy. And I mean, I just love it. I told somebody one time, I don't go just for the laughs. I go for the word. Do you feel the same way?
Yes, absolutely.
It's just amazing on how this energy continues to grow. But even Kevin Hart will tell you, and he's talked about this on his podcast, he's so afraid of the woke movement that a lot of these comedians are silencing themselves.
Afraid to say what they want to say. I hear you.
Yeah. To be a part of this project on A&E, I mean, talk about being in the right place at the right time. Right to Offend, the Black Comedy Revolution, we need this right now.
I think there's no question about that. I mean, it highlights this long tradition of the way that black comedians have historically spoke truth to power. But there's so many truths that need to be spoken to in this moment. So I think in that regard, there's no question that there's nothing more timely than this Right to Offend documentary series now.
In your research and experience, did the pioneers of comedy fear the consequences of going too far?
They absolutely did. I mean, when I think about, for instance, someone like Dick Gregory, I mean, they're existing in a moment in which black folks in general have to worry about saying things that might go too far. You know, that the wrong look, the wrong thing that they say, the wrong words coming out their mouth, I mean, literally could get black people killed. So when you're a comedian on stage and you have an audience, right, you have to be cognizant of what kinds of buttons you could push and not push in ways that protected you, but also protected the black community. And I think humor was the way that they were able to undermine, you know, some of the tensions of the moment by using humor to connect on a humane level, right? Even as they were speaking about things that were so critically important to black folks, particularly during segregation.
One of the things that we've seen and we've researched over the years when it comes to music is that a lot of Northern African-American men and women would come to the South, and the culture was so different and they had to protect. What about those where the comedy came from the South and had to go to a Detroit or a Seattle?
I think for some of those comedians, they felt a little bit of freedom. I always think of the story of Emmett Till, right, who goes down south to spend the summer with some of his family. And there are lots of black kids and black folks who would travel down south for summer vacations and get introduced, as you mentioned, to some of the constraints on what they could do and what they could say. I think for black Southern comedians to go up north to audiences that were also in some cases mixed, it gave them a little bit of freedom. I mean, it's no surprise to me that, you know, really one of the great comedians of the 20th century, Dick Gregory, finds his platform in a place like Chicago, right, where he has a little bit more freedom to push buttons than he might have had he been in Jackson, Mississippi. And of course, he found that out, you know, when he went to organize with Medgar Evers in Mississippi, right, literally being there with Medgar Evers hours before Medgar Evers was killed, you know, in front of his home.
One of my favorite places to be in a comedy club is I like to be in the green room with the comedian themselves, whether before they go on stage and watch them go through the transition where you can physically see them become another person, or in the moments afterwards, because I believe that post-production blues is an actual thing, and I just want to be there just to listen to them speak. What have you experienced on that level? Because so many people don't know that level of the comedy circuit.
You know, one of the people I've got to spend a little bit of time with, Marsha Warfield, right, who's featured in Right to Offend. And, you know, there's a stage presence, but to find them unguarded, right, and much more accessible, where they can tell a little bit more the details of how they came up, what their concerns or fears are, but even for them just to be funny in a way in which they're not performing, but just trying to make connection with people across the dinner table or something along those lines.
That's so true. When they drop their guard and they share their story, that's all they want. They just want their story to be heard. I love that moment where you can see it in the way they're breathing, that it's like they're going, okay, here we go.
Absolutely, absolutely, and honestly, the time that I spent with Marsha Warfield, she was far more funnier, right, with a group of 7 or 8 people, including at the time my 16-year-old daughter, than she was up on stage, right. And it wasn't that she wasn't funny on stage, but in that smaller environment, right, she could let her hair down, for lack of a better way to describe it.
I love the long list of entertainers that you've got featured on this 2-night program that's on A&E, which is just unbelievable in the way that you guys are presenting it. David Alan Grier, to me, he is that guy that knows the heartbeat of this nation when it comes to comedy, as well as bringing his acting forward.
One of the things that folks don't realize about David Alan Grier is that his father, William Grier, was a great psychologist, right, who studied the Black Power movement in the 1960s and 1970s. And so as a child of a family that, were aspirational in that regard and that was serious about the Black condition, he has brought that to everything that he's played, whether it's his work on In Living Color, the genius that we've seen of him in Queen Sugar, right? Even though the character is problematic, you saw that he had a kind of, chops, right, to do the dramatic work. Folks forget that he was in the film A Soldier's Play, A Soldier's Story, the film, but also the play back in the 1980s, right? And was a part of the, when they did a retrospective of it, right before the pandemic. So he's someone I'm glad that was part of this because it allows him to really get his props.
You bring up the pandemic. That was one of my learning lesson tools, only because I wouldn't stop reaching out to the comedians. They didn't have that platform. They didn't have that stage. And so I felt like, okay, we're going to talk. We're going to talk. Let's still give you that stage. And I continued to bump into comedians that didn't believe in the streaming platform. How has that changed comedy now that they realize, wait a second, there is an audience out there?
I think it's changed everything. I think for many comedians, access, whether it's, through YouTube or Instagram or other forms of streaming has changed the game for them. I think even more so, than musicians, right, who of course have been using things like iTunes and things like that for many years now. But for comedians, right, it allowed them not only to maintain the audience that they have, but to really build bigger audiences, right? Because now, you have to worry about being crowded up in a club, right? And the experience in the club is important, right? It's about being with all these folks, but now folks could take their humor literally directly to the people using streaming platforms.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Michael Shea. I mean, there's so many things that we learn every day from Michael Shea. For instance, his love for hoodies and stuff like that, and how Saturday Night Live would not let him wear one. This guy, I think, do you think he's being held back by Saturday Night Live? Because this guy has a voice.
Michael Shea is an interesting figure to me, because part of it is that, his humor is not laugh out loud funny, right? I think he's really in that tradition of the Dick Gregory's, right? Someone, or Paul Mooney, right? Even more so, that kind of really biting social criticism that he generates from. And so you have to pause, right? You find yourself laughing at Michael Shea's jokes uncomfortably, right? And I think that's part of what, concerns the producers at SNL, right? Who are trying to walk that fine line between really pushing certain kinds of buttons, but not pushing too far. And I think when you have a Black comedian like Michael Shea, right, it becomes a bit of a challenge, as it's almost been for virtually all of the Black comedians who have gone through SNL, going back to the first one, Garrett Morris, who thankfully also gets his shout out, and Right to a Fin also.
Michael's that guy, I always call it, he uses what's called the under voice. In other words, he will say things that it's not out loud, but it's like the member of the family that says something in the background. Oh my God, and he has mastered that.
Right. I'm hoping that, he will be able to build, and we've seen some of this now with some of the work he's doing, just to build a larger platform for himself and his work, and really encourage more comedians to take that particular tact, in the kind of comedy that he does.
How is your research unveiled when it comes to comedy competitions? I mean, it's like, how can you, because, I mean, we used to have one, what was it, on NBC every week that we'd sit there and these comedians would get out there and do their best. But my God, I know I couldn't do anything behind the stage with them because, I mean, to be let down on a joke that you put so much love into.
You think about the number of comedians, for instance, that came through, what we call the Chitlin circuit, this kind of network of segregated Black clubs and things like that. And, on a basic level, right, you made your money by being higher up in the bill, right? If you're at the top of the bill, you get the most money. The bottom of the bill, you get the least amount of money. That meant that implicitly there were going to be competitions, right? You got to outperform the person coming before you. And places like the Apollo Theater, right, the Regal Theater in Chicago really created this kind of environment where folks had to be competitive, right? But it was good natured, right? Because if I win tonight, you win tomorrow night, what wins out over and over again is comedy. Right. I'm going to be better because you challenged me to be better.
One of the most shocking things I've ever read was Steve Harvey's autobiography, where he called out Charlotte. He said Charlotte was his worst night ever because he was number 5 on the Kings of Comedy tour. And by the time he got up there, people were tired.
Right. Yeah. And what a classic moment that was in Charlotte, back in the early 2000s.
Oh, my God.
I think people don't realize the work that goes into being a comedian, right? And we see it, right? Because, we know lots of folks in our families, our friends, who are funny, right? But they can't translate that funny up on stage to be able to sustain it for a half an hour or 45 minutes or an hour and a half, right? There's another kind of skill set that's there. And because it takes a lot of work, the reality is that, comedians are going to fail as often as they succeed. I always like to use the analogy of baseball, right? The best baseball hitters, right? You got a 300 average, you're a very good hitter. A 300 average means you fail 7 out of 10 times. And I think that's the same thing, right? And again, the way comedians know how to work their material, go test it out in certain kinds of places, right? I often joke about the fact that, a few of Chris Rock's, most recent tours began in Durham. Right. That was going to be the testing ground, right, for him to be able to build his stage show, to be able to go to these other places. Right. And part of that process is knowing that some of the jokes aren't going to hit. Some of it is not going to be funny, that you got to go back to the lab, go back to the shed over and over again. Right. And the most successful folks are comfortable with that process.
How has the comedy world changed, and how will it change in the way that twice within a 2-month period, African-American comedians were attacked on stage, from Chris Rock to Dave Chappelle? I don't like that, where people think that they have the right to go up there and interrupt a process.
Part of the right to offend is also to have the right for people to critique what you're saying.
Wow.
But you cross a line. Right, because an audience member has a bunch of choices, a bunch of options, right? They can boo, right? They can not clap. They can get up and walk out. But it crosses a line, right, when you decide that you can go up on stage and you think that you have the right, right, to shut up a comedian by mushing them in the face or smacking them in the face. And like I am concerned about this particular moment, right? And it's not just comedy, right? We see this going on all throughout American society now. The comedy stage is just one of the places where it's been most visible to us.
Do you think that's because a lot of these comedians have learned the fine art of mastering the heckler, and so therefore they're bringing their heckling to a different level?
I think there's no question about that. As a comedian, you always have to adapt to your audience, right? And every generation brings a new set of questions, a new set of concerns, a new set of things that you can't talk about, that you might have been comfortable talking about 10 years ago, but you can't talk about the same way now, because society, changes, right? It develops, it goes forward, and comedians have to adapt to that, right? And I think you're right. Some of these comedians have learned how to deal with how hecklers function, over the last 10 or 15 years, and now it's another moment where they have to adapt. And hopefully that adaptation doesn't include literally have to being up on stage in body armor, right, to protect yourself from actual acts of violence. Sitting
down with James Gregory to hear his story as to why that he has to drive everywhere. He'll never get on an airplane, but he always has someone drive for him. I mean, there are so many things of realism when it comes to these men and women, because they're out there every night, and I can't imagine what it does to them mentally as well as spiritually.
You have to have a particular fortitude, to do this work, to be on the road all the time, to sometimes do, 2 shows a day. Back in the day doing the Chitlin circuit, sometimes it might have been 3 or 4 shows a night.
Yep.
And 5 times on Friday and Saturday nights. You have to have a certain kind of fortitude, right? What it means is that you have to love what you're doing, right? You have to have a passion for what you're doing. Whatever you feel about any comedian, whether you agree with their work or not, I think if they're doing something that moves you in some sort of way, you get the sense that they're doing this work because it is something that they love, that there's something that they're passionate about. And I think as long as the passion still stays at the center of comedy, or whether it's Black comedy or more generally speaking, I think comedy will still go forward and be an important contribution to how we think about life, in these United States.
When it comes to creating Right to Offend on A&E, you really dive into some serious archives and catalogs. I mean, this is amazing as a creative person, because how did you get inside, and how did you get all the permissions to make all of this happen?
Well, that's the great thing about the film directors, right? That there's so much archival footage and stuff that people didn't necessarily think was important, 50 or 60 years ago.
Right.
As I'm watching it myself, I'm wishing that I could see more of this archival footage, to see early footage of the Red Foxes and the Moms Maybelines and the Dick Gregory, right? Someone like Nipsey Russell. Right, those scenes from the Flip Wilson show, which I'm old enough to remember watching as a 5 or 6-year-old kid, up in the Bronx where I grew up. To be able to see this footage is so important. And one of the things I appreciate is that so many of the contemporary comedians who were interviewed in Right to Offend, they really are reverent and respectful to those comedians who came before them, right? Who literally cut the ground for them, not only to have a career, but to be able to have the kind of successful careers and financial success, that they've been able to have. I mean, when Dick Gregory, does the Playboy Club, right? And he talks about immediately, he goes from $200 a night to $3,000 a night. It changed the game, right? When we think about how successful at their peak or Richard Pryor or Eddie Murphy were as Hollywood film stars, right? Kevin Hart now, it's just extraordinary, in that regard. And the fact that they are still so appreciative of those folks who grinded it out, right, in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s is really one of the more heartwarming aspects of Right to Offend.
Kevin Hart is not embarrassed to say that he slept on many couches at friends' houses and stuff like that until things started clicking for him. He slept on that couch every night.
Yeah, I mean, that's why you got to love it. Right, you gotta love it to be able to struggle with it until you find success. And for some of these comedians, right, you're never going to be a Kevin Hart, right? You're never going to be a Wanda Sykes, right? But it's something that you love to do, that you're passionate about, and if you can make a living and provide for your family doing that, right? I mean, that's really where the tradition is, right? That's where Black comedy is so important. Not the megastars, right? Not Steve Harvey hosting, game shows and stuff like that. It's the comedians, the cats, the women who are going out there and hitting the tours and working on the material and being able to take care of their families, doing something that they love.
Speaking of Steve Harvey, there's so many times. I mean, first of all, I love his comedy. I love the way that he hosts. But I'll tell you what, when he releases those videos where he is sharing the word, oh my God. I mean, was there a certain time in his life where all of a sudden he said, you know what, I need to open my heart. I need to speak the truth.
Steve Harvey is just gifted, right? There's no other way to describe it. And I think for many of these comedians, right, obviously some of their inspiration is coming from other comedians, but some of these Black comedians are also coming up in the Black church, right? And they got to witness the way a Black preacher could control a room, could control a church, right? Using the right phrases, the right kind of cadences, right? And I think some of the older, Black comedians like a Steve Harvey, right? Or Cedric the Entertainer, right? They're bringing that to bear, when they're doing this stand-up work.
Yeah, see, I see Kevin Hart doing that too, because when he's on Shark Tank, the way that he's working those numbers and he's talking real business with real people, all of a sudden I feel like Kevin Hart is the next preacher, man.
Yeah, and shout out to Kevin Hart, right? To having Kevin Hart, to having the vision, right? To work with A&E to put this out in the world, right? Yep. Again, it is so timely and necessary for us to talk about this tradition of Black comedians and their right to offend.
Yeah. So now, Here's probably the toughest question. What's next? Because you're opening up the door, but we've got to activate it. We're talking about church. You heard the word. Now let's activate it.
Hopefully we get enough people to be able to watch this and to think differently. When we hear Black comedians, right? We've talked a great deal the last year or so about Dave Chappelle, right? And the kind of buttons that he pushes, right? and he has that right. That's the whole point of the documentary, right? This is your right? And in fact, as Alonzo Bolden says, right, it is in fact your duty, right, to offend status quo sensibilities in your comedy, right? And hopefully a documentary like this will allow us to be able to hear more than the ways that we feel insulted and offended by what we're hearing, and really start to talk about some of the truth, right, that is embedded in some of this commentary.
Wow. I know our time is up, but next time we got to talk about Jordan Peele. Here's a man that is very funny, that is just scaring the bejeebies out of us.
Absolutely.
Mark, please come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you.
Thank you, Arrow. Appreciate it.
Well, you be brilliant and go Blue Devils.
Yes. Go Duke.